Here's a question for you. We're in our series, the last message on our Crossroads series. And so we thought as we end this up, thinking about different crossroads that maybe you or I have been on. So the question is just simply this: what decision have you made in your life that as you look back, you see that decision just changed the entire trajectory of your life? So this is feedback time from you guys to us. What's a decision that you've made that you can share? Keep it PG. What college you went to? Yep. And that changed the trajectory for many reasons, right? Because that's where you met the gentleman you're sitting next to and the kids you have as a result. Yeah, that's a big decision. Who else? So the college you went to? So I heard who I married, and what did you say? Spouse. Okay, same thing. Yep. Who you married? Yep. That changes the trajectory of your life completely. Yeah. Definitely. Anybody else?
To try to make a living with music.
That's a tough one, isn't it? But it does change the course of your life. I know, Tim, you've had, because of that passion of music, it put you in a lot of different places in New York City and the West Coast and all that kind of fun stuff.
Des Moines, Iowa.
And now Des Moines, the city, the music capital of the world, Des Moines, Iowa. Yes, it's where everybody goes.
And with her and the cute kids.
That's right. I was thinking about this, and I told Amy, I said, it's really interesting. As you think about that question, it's hard to find a starting point, isn't it? You really can go back to where you first started making your own decisions. Probably, like Megan said, going to college for many of us was probably the first real decision we got to make, because up till that point, your parents made all the decisions for you. But even for me, the choice of going to college at Central Baptist College in Conway to pursue that, because that's where in my senior year I met a gentleman who had a connection with a church in Northwest Arkansas, which led me to go to that church when I graduated college. And after I was at that church for a few years, I left, but then because I had relationships there, I ended up going back. And then that's the church that ended up closing down right after I got back, which was tragic and sad and all that. But the church closing down then had me going searching for other churches, and I walked into this hotel church one Sunday where I met this guy named Tim, and he and I worked together for several years, and he then in 2005 moved here to be the pastor of Ashworth Church. And then I get a call from Tim that says, hey, would you like to come on staff? And it's like, who doesn't want to move to Iowa and be on church staffs, And so I get here, and then in, 2011, he leaves, and the church says, do you want to be, still crazy you guys ever asked me that, but you want to be our pastor? And I said, yes. But even before 11, in 2008, I was invited, because there were some members of this church, I was invited to Bill and Patrice Maurer's house, where I met this person here and was, introduced to the ministry of InterVarsity and became a advocate and supporter of the ministry. And in 2014, you came on staff. And I say that because I think back and I think, what if? What if I'd have made one tiny different decision, and going to college would have, I don't know where I'd be. I'd be in a much different place. I wouldn't be married to Carrie. I wouldn't be here. Wouldn't have the kids that we've adopted. It's crazy when you think about how one decision, you probably have your own story that could be how I interrupted your life.
Mine started. Yeah, when you said to me, why are you not considering coming to Ashworth Church?
Yeah, I'm still bitter about that.
Then here we were. We came, and then here I am now.
That's right.
But
That's right.
I was a Drake student too. Go Bulldogs, and that changed my life. Yeah. So it was too expensive. I shouldn't have gone there. But there's so many good things that came from that place.
Decisions. There's an interesting show on television right now that's kind of piqued my curiosity. It's called Ordinary Joe. Anybody watching that? It's kind of an interesting thing. It starts with this guy at his college graduation. And he's got 3 choices to make. It's like who he's going to go hang out with after he graduates, that graduation evening. And one of them is his longtime best friend, that girl, and that what happens from that. One of them is this new girl that he's just bumped into and what happens with his life there. And one of them is he goes and hangs out with his family and what happens. And it's kind of this twisted journey of just kind of intertwining these stories. But it's very interesting. But we often come to crossroads in our lives, and sometimes I think we forget the weight of those decisions. We forget to think about just how important some of these decisions can be and how much of an impact they'll have on our life. And so the series that we've been in has been talking about the biggest crossroads that I believe we come to, which is, what did Jesus accomplish when he died on the cross? And not just that, but then what do you do with that? What do you do with that? And Amy, as I was thinking this morning, I thought, you and I have very similar stories because we both grew up in very conservative, even fundamental Baptist homes growing up. And really, when faith was presented to us, or even the cross, it was kind of presented from a singular perspective, wasn't it? How did you grow up? How do you remember the cross?
I just remember I didn't want to go to hell.
That's it.
And I was really scared, and I always imagined that the rapture had happened. I'd heard about the rapture, and
I've heard
that
some
was
amens out there in that one.
And that was this theological
There'll be
thing.
a therapy group starting after church today.
Yeah, I'm here for you. I'll pray for you. And I remember my brother, later in life, Tim and I would tell these stories to each other. And we're like, wait, you thought that too? I would look around and be like, okay, is anyone that's a Christian outside? Because I don't see my mom and dad. Has everybody been taken up and I'm left here? So I thought of the cross as I better follow Jesus so that I don't go to hell.
It's very fear-inducing, though, right? And so I think growing up, we both that's exactly I can remember the evangelists coming in, the hellfire and brimstone preachers coming in, and literally scaring the hell out of you. I mean, it was all about hell all the time, and just to create fear. And so when you thought about the cross, you thought about this very singular thing, because it was because you're such a terrible person, because you were worthless and a worm and everything else, Jesus had to die. And just look at what you did to Jesus. And really, that is hopefully you've seen through the last several weeks, that is such a distortion of the cross. In fact, what I thought we could talk about first, Amy, was just, there's a lot of things we didn't say in this series because we don't believe that's what the cross speaks to. And that they're maybe even popular, but they're just not true. In fact, I wrote down here there are a few on the screen, starting with what I called the self-help gospel. You know what that is? That's the gospel where it basically operates on you do the best you can do, and the cross is really there to help you be better, but you've got to do it all on your own. And it's kind of an I obey, therefore I'm accepted by God. But you didn't hear us say that because we don't believe that's true. We don't believe that obedience is part of it, but it's an obedience because of what's happened to us, not to make something happen to us. Jesus has already done what was necessary, and so we don't have to live in that fear. And so it's not a self-help gospel. Amy, I see you have notes on
Okay, the gospel is sin management. I had notes on that because I'm this is the most unmotivating, what the cross is not. Yeah. I think this is part of what I learned a lot as a young Christian was manage your sin, hold it in, ask forgiveness a lot, but keep it in. And everything was about Jesus was just trying to help me manage my sin so that I wasn't a bad person or so that I wasn't too rebellious. And that one was very unmotivating to me. I would never have continued to follow Jesus if that was it, because I couldn't manage it. It was not manageable. I needed the what I talked about, I think week 1, the idea of the great exchange, that actually the gospel is not just us continually having all these issues with sin and having to manage those issues and Jesus forgiving us and continually having these issues, but it's no, actually, even though we don't act like it or even live like it always, the great exchange that happened at the cross is that Jesus took our sin and he gave us his righteousness, which
that's
again,
a tough concept to us, because it's if you think about it, if we really believe that, it means that even Jesus died for and paid for and has forgiven the sins you've yet to commit. Oh, that's heavy, right? I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about, because we think we think in such legal terms, or as my banking background would tell me, debits and credits, right? And so as long as I'm doing good, as long as I'm attending church, I'm building up those credits. In fact, we bring this into marriage sometimes, where we have heard it called the love bank. Don't overdraw that love bank. But we take that into our relationship with Jesus.
I can't manage that either. So.
You can't manage that either. But it's more than that. And what we have to understand is there's this much truth to what we're saying about sin management. Yes, we want to be holy. We're called to be holy. And when we mess up, when we screw up, we should take a posture of confession and repentance. But the cross is not just about you be a better person. In fact, that whole idea of the gospel of sin management was a term coined by a guy named Dallas Willard. If you've never, go search for that term. He's got a lot to say. But he talks about how this one reduces our faith to what you do rather than who you are as a person. And what the cross does doesn't just change your behavior, it changes us at our core. In fact, I was talking with Steve Rogers this week, and he was emailing me, and he said, this is what he was taught. This sin management. He said, I was taught and believed well into adult life that taking up one's cross amounted to mostly legalistically denying carnal desires and amusements. And I think we would all say, yep, we've been there, haven't we? I mean, sometimes that's kind of that faith that we are brought in. But then there's another pendulum swing, I think, too, which is the gospel of do-goodism, that it's all about doing good works or social justice or things like that. And not that any of this is bad. Doing good, Jesus changes our lives. We should work for the restoration of the world. We should seek the oppressed and help the oppressed and the people that need it. But it's more than that. And as I said, there's a little bit of truth in some of these, but really the cross is less about what happened and about who it happened to. And that's what we have to look at, is it's Jesus. And so as we were thinking about how to wrap up this series, we thought the biggest thing we want to address is, and so what does this mean? How does this matter for how we live our daily lives? How do we live under the cross, basically, is kind of that question. And I just want to throw that out there to you. So really, when we talk about living under the cross, it's really about how do we be a disciple of Jesus. And so how would you answer that question? How do we become a disciple of Jesus? It's okay. I can wait him out. What was that? Do what he commands. Okay. Oh, what was that? Relationship. Spend time with him. I still, back row, I'm hard of hearing. Do as he does.
Follow his examples.
It's like you guys have read the Bible before. That's exactly right. Love one another. How would you define that, Amy?
I mean, I think it's the relationship piece, and the way I understand it, and I was saying this week, is like, for me, I use Matthew as an example, my husband. I'm like, in some ways, we've become disciples of each other. We study each other. We're with each other all the time. So we influence each other. I'm like, I care about football. I care about basketball. I care about things I didn't care about previously. Right now he's in school getting his master's of social work. So I care about all the counseling, all the behavioral methods and all these things. I care about what he cares about because I love him the most, And so when he talks about things, I listen and I realize I'm doing them without even realizing it, I become like a little more of a gentle, quieter person. I really have. Because of him, that's saying a lot. And he is the same way. I watch him make connections with people, which he never used to know how to do.
That's right.
And so I see him I see the ways that I influence him. Do you know what I mean? That makes sense. It's like, in order to be a disciple of someone, you got to know them and be with them and have a relationship with them. And as you're with them, it rubs off on you. You're like, ooh, I start to care about the things that they care about. Absolutely. And I start to look a little more like Matthew, or I start to look a little more like Jesus in this case.
Yeah. And it does come down to relationship. What I think sometimes we try to do with the cross is we reduce it down to the least common denominator. And we try to say, okay, how do we make this as simple and as easy for everybody? In fact, I think one of the issues I take with the church in the last, 50 years is I think we did that to an extreme. There's an expression or a phrase that I use sometimes. It's called easy believism, where, we've reduced the cross to nothing more than fire insurance. Just like you and I, the way we kind of grew up, you have people talking about hell. I don't want to go to hell. The way we describe it, nobody wants to go there. So sure, I will say a prayer and then do whatever I want for the rest of my life, because that prayer is all that was required. I've checked the, appease God box here, so the rest of my life doesn't matter. And yet, when we turn our attention to the Bible and we look at Jesus' own words, there's something different. What we may have reduced it to really doesn't fly. In fact, in Luke chapter 14, and this is a passage that we could have picked up from a lot of different places. Jesus actually said this more than once. But in Luke chapter 14, look at what Jesus says here. He says, the large crowds were traveling with Jesus. And why wouldn't they? He was a very charismatic person. He was healing people. Man, he was where you wanted to be. And turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Wow.
I would not have chosen this passage, just so you know.
I know. Amy marks these out with marker in her butt. No, I'm just kidding.
It's a good passage.
It is a good passage. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Again, it's like Jesus is just like, this is not how to grow a church 101. This is, if you want to shrink the masses, let me tell you how. This is it right here. So he talks, keep going. He says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able to, with 10,000 men, to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for the terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciple. Now, you're right. This wouldn't be a passage we normally like to speak on, because what Jesus does multiple times in his ministry is he recognizes these crowds are following him, and then he makes these bold statements that really cut the crowd. I mean, this wasn't the only one. I say it here. I said it separates the looky-loos from the true disciples. And this is one example. As I said, he says this same thing a couple of times. But then there's another example where Jesus is talking to the crowds, and he's like, hey, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot be my disciple. And of course, then that's the moment where it says, and the crowd just left him. And the disciples are there with him, and he's like, are you not going to leave me too? And that's where the disciples say, where would we go? You are the one who has the words of life. And as I thought about this, I thought about how we have reduced the cross. How we have just said, say this prayer, or, fashion a Jesus that looks like you. But really, that's not what Jesus is calling us to. He's calling us to something difficult, something challenging. And I was just thinking, Amy, that, for many of us, it's easy to follow Jesus when things are good, when life is going well, when Jesus doesn't ask too much. But I don't know, how do you, here Jesus is asking a lot. What do you think about that?
When you first read it today, the first thing that came to my mind was like...
I wish we hadn't read this passage.
Yeah. After I thought that, it made me think of like a professor in a college setting who, like, everyone loves that professor, and they all sign up for their class, and then they get there day one and they read the syllabus. And then people start dropping out. Yeah, like,
I've done that before.
Me too.
Who else has done that before?
Me too.
There we go.
Okay, but the funny thing is that reminds me of like a professor I had in college who, she was totally that way. And I was like, no, I'm in it. Like, I'm going to do this, But it does make me think there is a cost. There's a cost. And I think of the passage of the parable of the man who had he had a lot of stuff, and he found a treasure in the field, and he buried it, went back, sold all of his things, and it says with joy he gave everything away, or sold his stuff or whatever, got rid of everything, and then he went back. And it was like, it's the idea of like, that's the kingdom of God. And so this is silly, but it's like the professor. It's like, actually the classes that are the hardest are the ones that are like, oh, they're so rich. Like I receive and I learn so much, and those are the things that change you. And I feel like that is true with Jesus. It's like, does he ask you for everything? Yes. Yeah. But the cost is so worth it because there's a treasure waiting for you, and there's something like, for me, I naturally like focus on the cost. I'm like, oh, I'm not real gritty, so I'm like, do I really want to do that? But yes, when I see what Jesus offers and the full abundant life that he offers and the goodness that comes in following him, and even in the really painful, hard times, I'm like, okay, I want to sell everything for this treasure of the kingdom.
But isn't it amazing, though, that Jesus has this way of putting his finger right on the things that are going to challenge us the most with his prominence in our lives? Because what Jesus is calling them to is a radical reorientation of their life. He's saying, if you're going to follow me, I got to be first. And that's the struggle, that's the challenge, because we see our stuff, we see our jobs, we see status, we see all these things, and we think there's so much more value there. And as Jesus is saying this, how many of you struggle with what Jesus said here when he says, you have to hate your father and mother and your wife and your children, your brothers and sisters? Anybody struggle with that? What in the world is Jesus talking about? Is he meaning like we have to literally hate them? And of course not. I read that and I think it's almost like Jesus is this angsty emo teen or something, out there. I hate you, mom and dad, But he's just, as we look at it, it's not actually hating people. It's just saying, look, all of life, everything in your life is going to be a matter of priorities. What gets first place? And Jesus is constantly just saying, where am I? Where am I? Where am I? And it's that evaluation. And there are so many things in our culture that do tug and pull for us, and honestly, I thought in American culture, it's very hard to hate everything when we have so much. The trappings, the stuff, the relationships. The cross challenges these idols that we have, the idols of money and the idols of stuff and even the idols of relationships. And Jesus even here challenges the idol that sometimes we make of family, because that can't be first place. And so it's hard. As Jesus makes this statement, we have to look at the cross and we have to go, it's difficult, it's challenging. And so how do we take up, go ahead.
Okay, I want to say something because I took a picture of a quote from C.S. Lewis. I'm not like texting people while I'm up here. So I was thinking about this actually this week, and what it is a reorientation of our lives. And I think it's easy for us, and even me in ministry, like, we've gone pro in our faith. Like, even for us, it's like, it can just become a job or like a task or something. And I think the continual invitation is Jesus is like, reorient your life around me. And that changes everything. That requires you to like release everything and then reorient everything around me. And actually, that's so much better. And you're talking about like we have to give up all these things, like good things and all those things. And here, there's a quote by C.S. Lewis that I thought of when I was thinking about this idea. He says, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased." And I've always loved that quote and thought about that this week. I'm like, oh, that's me. Like, I'm like, I don't want to give up all this stuff because I want these things. But actually, if I am willing to say, no, I don't, I'm going to give these things up, trust in the goodness of God, reorient my life around him. Like, there's an offering that he has for me of something so much greater. Yeah. It's the holiday of the sea instead of the, mud puddle that I'm
absolutely
playing in.
And it is, we look at Jesus as less than. And that's why he's saying, yeah, it may feel that way sometimes. And let's just be real, it does feel that way sometimes. It feels like you have to miss out on some things when you follow Jesus. And from where we sit in our fleshly, humanly eyes, we think, oh, we're having to give up so much. When if we trust Jesus, if we look, he's like, yeah, you're really not giving up anything. You're getting everything from him. You know, as I thought about the words that Jesus used here, and we'll put them up on the screen about what does it mean to take up our cross. And he uses the word hating, and we've kind of talked about that. It is the reorientation. It's giving up. It's loving some other things less and loving Jesus more. That's what he's talking about. And he talks about denying self and moving from a self-centered position, which is very hard because everything in this world says, look out for number one. If you're not looking out for yourself, who's going to? Well, Jesus says there's a system out here. There's a kingdom that exists where, guess what? Where other people will care about you enough and love you enough and look out for you, where you're not having to do that for yourself. He also talks about carrying your cross. Here's an interesting thing. That has become so metaphorical for us, but think about Jesus saying these words in the first century. You must take up your cross. This was something they had all seen. They had seen somebody carrying a cross to a place of crucifixion and being hammered to the cross. This wasn't some metaphorical pie-in-the-sky thing. This was a real thing that they had experienced. And when Jesus says, take up your cross, what he's saying is it's a deliberate and a daily denying of self, but it means dead man or dead woman walking is what he's talking about here, to let go of those things that are going to continue to pull against us, against God. And then he says, follow. And we talked about, somebody said that earlier, to live as Jesus did. And I think that's the challenge, because we're living in a time, and we talk about this often, where even the religious, even those who follow Jesus, seem to be clamoring for power and prestige. And that is not what following Jesus is about. It is about even being willing and sacrificing ourselves on the cross. And I'm just going to tell you, if anybody's carrying a Jesus flag and it doesn't look like the way Jesus did, they're not representing Jesus. And I'd question their discipleship, honestly.
I remember talking about this with you a while ago, but it's like the culture, everything around us, and the church included, it's always about like upward mobility, you know, like how do we get bigger? How do we get better? How do we grow? How do we like get, you know, more recognition and all those things? Like that's so much of American culture even, and probably just our drive and desire. And actually Jesus, like following Jesus requires, or like there's an invitation to downward mobility, which is weird. It's like, very countercultural. Like,
it makes no sense.
Would you actually be downwardly mobile? Would you pursue humility? Would you pursue life on the fringes? Would you pursue, like, you know, seeing the needs around you and meeting those and following me to those places and denying yourself in a lot of those ways?
Yeah. One commentary I read this week, the author just made this comment. He says, Jesus is not a minimalist. It's not a matter of how little I can give, but how much God deserves. And I thought, man, that's a powerful statement. It's not a matter of how little I can give. Notice that the call for discipleship, Jesus says, if anyone, it's not an exclusive thing. And as I thought about that, I thought, you know, it's not just for the religious, because it's the religious that seem to have the most problem in following Jesus. It's when we have a bunch of stuff, it's when we're in positions of power that we find it the hardest to let those things go, because that's what Jesus is calling us to. And on the flip side, it's not just for the religious. It is, they can come too. It's not just for those that have it all together. It's especially for those who have been marginalized, the oppressed, the outcast, the neglected. And I wrote down here in my notes, I said, keep in mind that those in power were the ones who set themselves up against Jesus and his teachings. Those were the ones that resisted, because the cross didn't appeal to them. There was something about the cross that they went not interested.
They had the most to lose.
They had the most to lose.
Like,
you're exactly right.
Thinking about power
and we're not so willing to give that up. So what we want to wrap up with today is just this: count the cost. You know, it's not just this easy, say a prayer and you're done and in. Jesus wants people to sit down and consider what following him is going to cost them. It's not an easy decision. And we read in the Bible that there were people that were encountered that question. They came to face with that question, and it says they walked away sad because the cost was just too high. Steve Rogers, in that email he sent me this week, I put this on the screen for you. Steve, you didn't know you were going to be quoted. Be careful what you email me. Within the context of the Sermon on the Mount, he said, I now see that taking up the cross and following Jesus is giving oneself to love of God, self, neighbor, and enemy. It is servanthood, peacemaking, generosity toward others, and championing the cause of the least of these. This is what embodies Jesus in confrontation of ungodly power structures that oppose God's kingdom in our present world. Isn't that a great statement? That's why I included it, because I thought there's power there. You know, the cross is concerned with how you live. We don't want to miss that because it is important. But as Amy and I were talking this week, we had this, I thought this was just a powerful quote. The cross isn't just a death changer, it's a life changer. For many of us, it was just about our future reality, but it changes our present reality. And even as you look at what the Apostle Paul said in Galatians 2:20, he said, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in my body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And we're called to that. But I don't want to ever diminish what that call looks like, because it's a serious call. It's not an easy call. It's not a simple call. But it is a life-changing call that is worth every moment and every ounce that I can dedicate myself to as I love and follow Jesus. So we just end with this final question here. Now that you've seen the cross and you stand at the crossroads, what will you do? Now that you've seen the cross and you stand at the crossroads, what will you do? Let's pray.